What feels like good programming can often be bad programming. What seems like the right way to do it is very often the wrong way to do it. And that's what I want to talk about today, because it's an important problem that derails a lot of game developers, especially at the beginning level. Just got off of an office hours call with one of my home team members discussing this and realized how pervasive it is. So figured to make a video to share with you this general thing you can use no matter how you're going about it. Now, part of where this arises from is that quite often people who've made a bunch of games will just kind of brute force their way through a problem. They'll do it in a way that is simple, that doesn't involve a bunch of complexity, that doesn't involve a custom data structure, that doesn't involve tons of comments to explain how and why the code works the way that it does. And then somebody else, newer to the code base, will take a look at that and say, well, that's not how I would have done it. And maybe that person has a comp sci degree or has spent many years doing boot camp training and so on. And very often, the person who's saying that has never actually finished anything, has never built anything done, released, showable. And so the real solution to if you had done it the way they would have done it is it wouldn't exist. This question wouldn't come up because you wouldn't have gotten this far. And part of what's going on is that when we make these sort of trade-offs, on the continuum, there's always a continuum. It's not like there's a right and wrong way. There's usually a continuum between the two. There's trade-offs where on the one hand, there's a way which might technically, by something we could write a paper on the difference of, have some sort of subtle advantage in optimization and memory allocation and organizational structure, and somehow ideal by some abstract notion of elegance. That in the code itself is pretty irrelevant. Player won't ever be able to tell. Won't actually affect frame rate because of how rarely the operation is called. One of these things where in theoretical discussions the C constant is ignored, and in reality in many cases that C constant is pretty important as to what is the multiplier on how often does this actually come up. Now to base this in a concrete case, it's actually where one of the examples that came up for me, so back before I ran home team game dev to make my training one-on-one with people more scalable, more affordable to folks. When I was still working one-on-one with people, one of my clients was somebody who, I don't want to narrow down who it was, student at DigiPen, and he had me helping out with one of his assignments back then. He was stuck with some questions. We were mostly focusing on his side project, but he had questions about this assignment, trying to understanding how to do this thing they were assigning him to do. And what they had him doing was he was applying some game programming patterns, which if you're not familiar with game programming patterns, it's a free book out there. It's based on a classic programming textbook called Design Patterns, which has a variety of techniques that are, in many cases, useful tools to be aware of, good ways to do things. Unfortunately, the assignment was applying those patterns in cases where it was not only unnecessary, but was actually really frankly the wrong and inappropriate way to do it. He was taking something that was a much more sophisticated, heavy-duty pattern to solve certain cases and applying it in a breakout game where it was really the wrong fit for the way to do it. There's a different pattern, actually flyweight would have been the right solution to the brick situation he was running into. He was doing some other pattern that just did not fit. And it was his assignment. He was required by his teacher at the institution to do it this way. This is important for several reasons. First of all, it actually makes the programmer a worse programmer, either to themselves or to a team. They become a liability to the team. Because anything that you're doing in code, there's different ways to do it. There's faster, slower ways, not just for the machine, but for you as the human being doing it. Not only as to how much of your time does it take, but how much of your cognitive overhead does it take. How complex is it to debug or troubleshoot if something isn't working about it? And so one of the things we need to be factoring for at a practical level if you're building something are these things about, yeah, but programming energy is finite. And there are thousands of things on the list to do. And maybe this particular thing either isn't worth doing this overstructured way, or again, is literally the inefficient way to do it. And this is the sort of thing that especially terrifies when there's a business person, as there often is, if there's a paying gig involved, somebody's hiring somebody else to get a thing done, because they don't have the programming skills to do it themselves. In those cases, they're actually fairly worried about, yeah, I know that there's a different way to do stuff. There's a version you could do that would take you 3 years. There's a version you can do that would take you 3 months. Version you can do that would take you 3 days. I need to make sure that you're not getting lost in the sauce, under the hood, wasting time doing stuff in a way that you feel is speaking to some sort of abstract notion of elegance that actually is, again, zero payoff to the player and isn't actually in any way improving debugability, robust, ability to extend it. Now, to that same note, an asterisk here, I'm not saying either that everything therefore is the answer to be super hacky slop that no one else can read or navigate. It is important and meaningful to write code others can read, including yourself in the future. There are absolutely times and places when different programming patterns are the right solution. That set of tools exist because they solve real problems that we run into. But if you're not applying it to solve a real problem, then you're misusing the tool. Might as well take a screwdriver and try to bang a nail into the wall with it. And so this is a case where we're discussing when there's someone who in home team wants to focus on some specific programming patterns, wants to be able to show in his portfolio, I've done some programming patterns. Now, unlike the way that Digipin professor had him doing it, which makes me think that this Digipin professor somehow, which doesn't seem like that school, and I don't mean to trash on the school in particular, this particular individual teacher apparently never actually built a thing, or they wouldn't have recommended this pattern for this use of the problem. What we came up with was pick a few patterns that interest you, and we'll design some projects specifically around, here are some things that are going to make use of. If you want, okay, I don't know, we want to focus on game juice, then like object pooling is going to be super important. If we want an environment with a ton of moving objects that bang into each other, spatial partitioning is going to be important. If we want something where we have like a custom, I don't know, some sort of turn-based time sequence where you can undo things, command pattern is going to be important. But we're going to create a situation where it needs that pattern to be the right solution to the problem at hand, not take something which, like a game looking like Pong, would have been fine without it. Because again, that literally means it's the wrong solution to the problem. You're not going to impress an engineer in an interview by saying that you overdid it the wrong way. That's the opposite of what is good. They want to know that you understand the trade-offs. That's part of my work as a rapid digital prototyper. When I worked for big companies, small companies, R&D, academia, and so on, has been knowing what those trade-offs are to be able to know the line of when and how. If you just need a thing that works by noon, I can make it do that. I'll tell you to not build another code. If you need a thing you can build on and have strangers carry on, I've also written educational code, where the whole point is here's code that is readable by a beginner, operatable on by a stranger, which you program very differently from something you do for yourself. Now, this isn't just about code architecture. This also applies to things like comments. And I suspect you hopefully saw the Jonas video the other day, where Jonas gave a workshop about some Unity stuff, an interesting way of applying the state pattern, just as an example of another programming pattern. Although in this case, not even using programming to do it, but using the animator. It was a pretty cool video. Check out that workshop. Also on this channel just a few videos ago. One of the comments he had was about comments in code, which is that quite often, it's one of these things. I think when someone's a newer programmer, they might have the wrong impression that better code means writing a comment everywhere. Every line should have a comment. Every function should have a comment. Comments all over the place. And any experienced real programmer who's released products and shipped stuff, such as Jonas, who was the lead engineer for Subnautica, or such as myself, who's released well over 100 games, will tell you that quite often those comments are bad. That is a bad way to do it. Comments are useful. There are times and places for them. If you've got an algorithm to explain why something unusual is happening, do that. If you've got something where there's a special constraint to keep in mind, mark that. Otherwise, where possible, ideally, you're writing simple enough code that it's pretty unmistakable what it's doing. You're using descriptive enough functions and variables to have to explain all kinds of caveats of what's meant by this. Even if it's a smidge more verbose, better that than leaving the chance that the comment and the function itself fall out of date. You're just doubling the amount of stuff to maintain, especially because people start to sort of, just like we stop seeing ads on the internet, we stop seeing comments in the code until someone else comes back to it later and realizes that it's months wrong for what's actually happening. Further makes debugging even harder because conceptually we're loading up something that is different from what the code is doing. We should go back to our very first point about over-architecting, over-engineering, overdoing code, doing it the wrong way, where instead of focusing on what is the practical benefit to the project, which I phrase as such because it's not just to the player, it is holistically as a project. Is this a piece other people do need to write code in? Is this a part we do need to build on? Well, and you still do it a little bit differently, somewhere in that continuum. A little less hacky than if it's just you off in a corner with a piece no one else has to touch. Well, even then, simple code is better. And this is one of the things that I learned when I have a former coworker who's a ex-Google systems scalability engineer guy. And one of the things he taught was that very much people might assume from the outside, because they hire, in many cases, top-tier CS graduates, and they put them through tricky whiteboard algorithm exams, famously. Hopefully they stopped doing that. I bet they haven't. But when Google has engineers, they encourage them to write the simplest code that works that gets the job done, because it's going to be easier to debug. It's going to be easier for the programmers. It's going to reduce confusion. Again, it also reduces your cognitive overhead, which is just a fancy way of saying how much of your mind is getting burnt up, exhausted on just getting this thing done, getting this piece done so you can go pay attention to the other 10,000 pieces that also need your attention today. And so this is a plea for, I know it's hard to see where and how is that divide. So one of the other things that also we do in Home Team, and it's very particular to our approach, in addition to the fact that, like I say, any of this kind of stuff we're doing because we have a practical application. We're demonstrating here is why and how we did that, because it serves this use case, because it's a reason to use it as opposed to arbitrary. Another part of this is also that the best way to learn it, and what we do sometimes have people who will release several projects doing stuff in kind of a clumsier, more brute force way, but in a way that works for them for the scale that they're at after the fact. after they've written the code, after they got it working. And actually, there's another project leader I was meeting with who sometimes he has this going on. We'll look at it. I'll help him refactor it a bit, do a bit of rearranging so it's the same functionality. Specifically because here's a common pattern recurring in the way that he's doing something. There's a more efficient way to do it. That's not necessarily more complicated. That's not necessarily fancier, but saves a bunch of work. Makes it easier to debug, makes it easier to build on, makes it faster to do. And quite often that pain point, that discomfort, that wincing effect of realizing after the fact, I can't believe I spent 3 hours doing that when there was a 20-minute solution. Or I can't believe I kept doing some certain copy-paste stuff if there's another way to do it. That's part of the learning process. That's not skippable. That's something where it's important that we avoid this thing that I've probably mentioned before on the channel because it's a common recurring point in my teaching approach. One of the youth educators I used to work with years ago would talk about the problem of what he calls snowplow parenting. It's not just parents. This also applies to general adults in someone's life, which can include their teachers, instructors, coaches, and so on. Where if someone tries to stay in front of them at all times, making sure that they never encounter any obstacles, they never have any difficulties, never have any snow to trudge through because it's all getting plowed out from in front of them, then they never learn how to get through that on their own. They've been shielded from too much of it. And so instead, the learning approach, where possible, and something I encourage, something I've structured part of a home team's approaches around, is in many cases to try to steer you faster into hitting the limits of doing it the worst way. Because there's a range for which it is actually the better way. If you're rapid prototyping, if you're just getting a piece together to demonstrate, to discuss as a conversation piece, to test an idea, you need to do it the fast way. To hit the limit of that, where singletons are catching up to me, where doing if-elses is no longer the right way to solve this, where, shoot, I was using globals because I could get away with it, and that's starting to catch up to me. Seeing where that dividing line is requires getting it wrong, and more importantly, getting it wrong in a safe context to fail. And this is where, to their credit, in many cases where a teacher is trying to teach something dogmatically of memorize this pattern, just apply it by default and so on, what they're really trying to do is they're snowplowing. They're trying to prevent you from making a mistake that would get you in trouble. And this is one of the challenges of learning on the job, where in many cases, if our company's on the line, or if we're going to be judged by a senior engineer looking at code review, etc., we might worry about being perceived the wrong way if we do something in a way that there was some better solution for that has been solved by the history of computing. But then you never actually learn where the line is. And again, you wind up with these things where someone will spend months, literally months, it's not even a joke, and I've seen these examples where people come to me about what they're doing, and we help sweep up and figure out what they've been doing before they got involved in my process and my teaching approach. And they were just doing all kinds of factory patterns in cases where it had absolutely no reason to be done that way. There was all kinds of different layers of complexity in a way that they were not even leveraging the benefits of. And it is lost effort, it is lost time, it is doing it wrong, incorrect, bad. Other engineers who are experienced will look at that and say, we don't want that person on the team, that is a liability. We're going to give them a task that should be done in an afternoon and it's going to take them weeks. Because they're trying to be too careful about how they think they're getting it done just right, just perfect, elegant, clever. And of course, it's one of these classic deals. If you write overly clever code, you're not going to be clever enough to debug it. And sure as heck, not someone else who didn't write it. And then you wind up going in there writing a bunch of unnecessary comments to explain why and how it's written so cleverly, but be careful about these edge cases, as opposed to just get the feature stood up, get it working. Don't be careless about it. If there's a case where the runtime is going to just degrade your performance, there is a time and place for that. And again, in many cases, the best way to find that limit is to run up against it in a safe context to learn from, where you can recover from it. That's why everything we do in Home Team is freeware, where we want people to make those mistakes, to be able to have those errors where they can affect the game's performance, see the impact, have wiggle room to fix it, not be blamed, not be accused, not be held in a negative light for it, but to make those mistakes safely, recoverably, to get answers to their questions about, okay, I did this. I can tell it's a little rough. Should I have done it different? Did I overdo it? What do you recommend I focus my attention on next? Can make a huge difference. And this also worked pretty unique to our approach as opposed to a standard education model. For me, it's modeled actually after how we did things in woodworking. It's where we went to the person, we had a question, they put us back on the path of largely self-educating. There's a lot of stuff you can find on the internet. There's a lot of stuff you can read and look at on YouTube and answer for yourself and find examples. And for those, it is a waste of your time and someone else's to have them working with you on that particular thing. Where it's valuable is to have someone else be able to look at your thing, your specific situation, help dig you out of a hole you got stuck in, talking you through different solutions. Where it's handy is when they can help point you in the right direction for course correcting, for, see you're starting to veer a little this direction. that happens. That's part of what we see happen. Here's a way you can kind of pivot to make sure you're using your energy efficiently for what your ultimate goals are. And that third part, where I say ultimate goals, which also came up today in the meeting, is again where a lot of choices we make, there's not a single right answer. It depends so much on context. It depends on whether you're trying to market yourself and build up your identity as someone who's going to run your own indie company. It's very different from, I want to be working at a giant company as a position of support role, as opposed to even in the middle, I want to be doing contract freelance, which occasionally is a part of on the side when you're running your indie company. If you're trying to stay afloat that way, like I may recommend in my other video, just at a high level example I'm talking about there, it's again why this feedback requires a human being, not a machine, to be having a conversation with you about your goals, your objectives, your trade-offs, your background, where you're going with it. Just at a high level example of that, right? If you're just thinking about your holistic portfolio, what are you trying to put together? What story do you want to tell a year from now? If you're trying to do an indie game, track in life, which no one in our group is going to mislabel about, not me, not our trainer, etc. That is a risky thing. That is an expensive thing to do. That takes time, takes networking, takes business acumen. That is not what we're primarily about, but we can talk to you about the challenges of it and navigating it and so on. Obviously, in that case, you're trying to find your voice. You're trying to make a very unique, personal, expressive, different kind of thing in a way that doesn't necessarily make you good employee number 300 at a giant company. They don't want person who's got their own vision they want to run with. What a big company usually wants to see is they want someone who's comfortable with support roles. They want to see that you can polish stuff. They want to see you can take a simple idea and really run with it. They want to see you can take an established genre and have a cool twist on it. They want to see perhaps, I had a discussion today about one of the other ways to kind of make himself appealing if the path he's looking for in life is that, focusing on tool development, making a better level editor, making extensions for things inside Unity, making ways to author dialogue systems and custom formats better to streamline the energy and efficiency and time of other people on the team, because it's a really good appeal to a company to come at them and be able to say, here's how I can help you get better results faster out of the people you already have and the talent you already have, and free them up to do things that they have to do. There's not a better way to do. And that comes from being a tool person in a way that it's a part of the indie side of stuff. It's not necessarily as a priority to surface and discuss and show up in a portfolio. In the middle case where I said contract freelance, that's where it's the high level, right? You're actually looking at a scattered portfolio of variety, an infinite runner, a match 3, a tile-based game, a polygon-based game, a 3D thing, a 2D thing, a mobile thing, a VR thing, etc. And that's because if you're doing the contract freelance life, oftentimes what you're looking for is you're being picked up by somebody who they're again hiring you because they don't have that skill set. And what gives them the peace of mind, even though a programmer's a programmer and you could figure out the differences, if they can see in your portfolio, actually looking for someone to make us an infinite runner. Look, Tim here's done it. That's going to give you a leg up for somebody else. If they're like, yeah, actually, I'm looking for a Raycaster. Mark has done that. If we're looking for like, you know what, I was looking for like a 3D puzzle game that runs on mobile, and we see Mary has done exactly that, that helps give them an advantage towards having that conversation look appealing. And I've been on the other side of that when I was hiring artists for projects years ago with some publisher funding, and it was a matter of like, okay, well, who's already drawn stuff that's the style I'm looking for? Because as a non-artist, which is why I'm hiring an artist, I don't have a strong enough sense for how much I can take what someone does now as like a graphic novel style and be like, can you make it children's book illustration style? Some can, some can't. I don't know if I haven't seen it. And that winds up a different answer as to which way you're trying to go with it, as well as a different answer potentially. We talked about this initial question, why I brought this up in the scheme of this topic, about good code being bad code. One of the things we have to be careful about is that code that is great if you're trying to make the indie path in life a priority. And your goal is just, I need to be able to get more out of the time that I have. I need to be able to get results that people look at and can't even picture, how did I pull that off? That involves cutting a lot of those corners energy-wise because your resources are very strapped. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, the giant company size, if you want to be engineer number 30 on a team, yeah, oftentimes those are places where they would prefer to see that you err in favor of scalability, documentation, and other things in a way that is completely unworkable at the smallest scale. But the team blows up if everybody just gets too wild and too free about cutting corners at the bigger size. Again, notwithstanding like the caveat I had of Google's thing of writing simple enough code other people can read and diagnose and troubleshoot it when possible, only when, if, and how it's necessary to draw upon a more sophisticated tool, a custom data structure, a bit more cleverness. Sometimes that's the answer you need. That's why game programming patterns exist. But ideally, you're situating it in a way that's an appropriate use for it, instead of setting yourself as a liability of someone who's going to apply the wrong solution to the wrong problem. That's it for the day. Thanks for following along. As always, if you think things sound cool about our approach of Home Team Game Dev, where we're building games in applied real release situations, we're actually just now in the final wrap-up stages of our 100th game we're going to release in the past 5 years-ish. If you like this idea, if you run into questions and then support trainers, myself included, meet with you one-on-one. We have these conversations about what are your paths, what are your goals, what are the problems. Let's look at the exact situation you're running into in this project, help you through it. How can we pitch projects that show off the things you want to highlight to fit into tell the story in your portfolio you want to show? When and how is a solution you're interested in an appropriate fit based on our experience? All this stuff happens at Home Team. It's included as part of membership. Check that out at hometeamgamedev.com. See you there. That's it for the day. Catch you next time.